I'm going to click on this, and we're going to do that. And I think we are good to go. Hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So thrilled to have you joining us for our ongoing virtual author event series, which we were just talking to some of our guests here. We've been doing since April of last year and have done about 175-ish virtual events in that time. And actually, believe it or not, we just had our first in-person event with actual human beings in a room together on Saturday, just this past weekend. It was great and surreal and wonderful and weird and all those things combined. But it was so nice having people in a room kind of laughing together and spending some time together and being safe and smart about that at the same time. So hoping to do some more of those in the coming weeks and months. We have a little bit of a break, actually. We're going to be taking most of August off because, as I mentioned, we've been kind of going nonstop for the past year plus. So we're going to give our staff a little bit of a break in August, but then be ramping back up quite quickly here in September and into October. I'll mention a couple of little teasers. We're going to be doing things with Sandra Cisneros, Anita Hill, all kinds of amazing people this fall. So if you'll pay attention to our website, magiccitybooks.com, you can see all of those things and get announcements about the details on that. Tonight's going to be really fun because I think when we think about the made-up concept, of course, of summer reading and things we want to escape into, I think a lot of people think about thrillers and horror writing and books that kind of keep us on the edge of our seats. So when we had the opportunity to do this event, which we're calling Women of Horror, we thought it'd be fun to kind of pull together a panel and have a discussion about two really wonderful books that are going to kind of keep you up all night and keep turning those pages. So we're really thrilled to have Emily Beyda and Julianne Pachico with us to talk about The Body Double and The ANTHILL, which this is like the same joke I do every time, but I'm just going to say it again. We're doing a special tonight, 2 books for the price of 2. It never gets old. I always like to say that. So for those of you watching, have heard that a million times. First, just thanks for watching so much. And second, forgive me on repeating my jokes over and over again. But I'm also thrilled because I love it when I get a chance to be part of the audience and sit back and enjoy the event. And we have a very special guest joining us tonight for our moderation, which is Emily Hughes from Tor Nightfire, who is going to be leading this discussion. And we want you guys to be part of this discussion too. So if you will put your questions into the Q&A function here while we're going along, Emily, we have 2 Emilys. We should say like Emily H and Emily B, maybe. I don't know how we want to do that. Emily will pull some questions from you guys and feed those into the action that will be happening tonight. And of course, most importantly, reminder, if you would like a copy of these books or a couple of copies or gifts for your friends, or if you just want to read it more than once, go to the chat function here and you can get those directly from us. And I would just say, reminder, Magic City Books is a nonprofit bookstore. So you're not just getting some great books, but you're also supporting the efforts that we do here in our community as well. So I want to say thank you again to both Emily's and Julianne for joining us. And I will turn it over to Emily H for this special presentation. Thanks and have fun, everybody.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Magic City for hosting this event. I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Wanted to just introduce both of our authors tonight. First off, we have Emily Beyda. Emily is a Los Angeles native who for the past 3 years has written the popular Dear Glutton advice column in the Austin Chronicle. A graduate of Texas State's MFA program, she currently resides back in LA. The Body Double is her first novel. And then we have Julianne Pacheco. Julianne is the author of The Lucky Ones. She grew up in Cali, Colombia, and lived there until she was 18. She has a PhD in creative writing from the University of East Anglia in England, where she is now a lecturer. Her story, Honey Bunny, appeared in The New Yorker, and 2 of her stories have been anthologized in Best British Short Stories 2015. In 2015, she was longlisted for the Sunday Times EFT Short Story Award, and in 2017, she was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. And of course, she's here today for the ANTHILL. So welcome to both of you. So happy to be here talking with you both. I love these 2 books in conversation because they both have a lot to say about identity and how it's more of a slippery concept than we really like to admit to ourselves. But first off, given that this is a women in horror event, I wanted to ask you both, what does, especially since neither of your books are what we'd call sort of classic, slasher supernatural. I mean, there are supernatural elements certainly in the ANTHILL horror, but they both really are unsettling and creepy and they get under your skin in interesting ways. So I would love to ask you both, and maybe Emily, let's start with you. How do you define horror? What is horror to you?
Well, that's such a good question. It's probably like a I know it when I see it kind of situation, right? But I do think that for me, uncanniness is really the most important thing when it comes to horror writing. I think probably the horror writer that was the most formative of an influence on me was Shirley Jackson. And she's somebody that does that really well, where she'll give you something that's completely ordinary, like a sugar bowl, but just move it so slightly to the left of your ordinary perception of it that it becomes really, really terrifying. And that to me is when horror, I think, works the best, is when it's in this kind of like slippery place.
Absolutely. Julianne, how about you?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that phrase, if I know it when I see it. I suppose, like, as a reader, like what I would associate with horror is, yeah, kind of like a feeling like in your body, like you really know, like with your body, like in your stomach, that feeling of tension, of suspense, of just wanting to, keep turning the page, but also not really wanting to because you're afraid what's going to be on the other side. Yeah, and also a kind of feeling of dread of just sort of what is waiting for me. So yeah, I think that's what I kind of like most about horror, both as like a writer and as a reader. It's just like a really useful way to make the reader feel something, and I always really like books that make me feel something in like a really strong way.
Definitely.
That's a great point.
Yeah, like the idea of it being embodied, I think, is really key.
Yeah, because you have that stomach clenching feeling of, as you were saying, Emily, I've got to know what happens. I want to know what's on the next page, but also I don't. But I think that need, that like driving need to get to the resolution is a big part of it. And I think that's also something that's very much at play with both of your two protagonists. Julianne Maria Carolina, who goes by so many names throughout the book, is someone who has this really profound need to just figure out what happened in her life and figure out, what her past really is, and get somebody else's perspective on it so she knows what really happened to her, what her childhood was like. And with the unnamed protagonist of The Body Double, the not Rosanna, I guess I'll say for brevity's sake, she is, both of these characters are sort of adrift, right? They need direction, they need some sort of motivation, they need some definition of self, right? And to me, that really resonated with my experience of being, a 30-something woman in 2021, where I'm like, all right, I'm far enough out of college that I've been in the work world and I know, sort of how the world works. But I'm sort of like, I'm just far enough out of college to be like, okay, but what's next, right? And I think that that's something that, a lot of people, but especially a lot of women in the sort of ways that are addressed in these books, resonate with. And I wanted to ask if both of you sort of had personal experience with that, or if that was more of a conscious authorial choice. Julianne, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is really true. It's like the true horror is like being a woman in like the early 21st century. So, yeah, so many potential horrific things to explore about that. Yeah, I think like the word like disaffected is like something that I think is used a lot for that kind of, yeah, kind of early 30s like woman narrator. I know that when I was talking about the book with my editor, like she mentioned people like Otessa Moshfegh, who's like a writer I really like. Yeah, I mean, you know, I wouldn't say it's like something I was consciously trying to do. And like, I don't, you know, I don't write like autofiction. Like I don't write characters that are supposed to be me. Though sometimes it's fun to put in like little details where you're like, ooh, people will think that this is me, but I know it's not. So that's always like a fun little game to play. But yeah, you know, I think you know, maybe that is kind of like an interesting trend that we're seeing, a sort of, you know, that kind of like age group of women narrators.
Yeah. And can I say something about the anthill too that I think is really interesting in this regard? So there's this book that I really like that's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. I know, right? And it's this Lacanian feminist scholar. It's like her critique of all these different horror films. And in it, she has this term that she talks about. She calls it the effluvial feminine, which is the idea that in horror, there's all this idea of like the woman's body is a space of permeability. So obviously in slasher films, this is very literal. It's like people getting stabbed or whatever. But then in horror films, this sort of like externalizes the effluvial spaces of the woman's body and takes that into the world and makes the world kind of confront it. So there's like the elevator in The Shining is a great example, or like the lake scene at the end of Friday the 13th, where you think you're safe, but then you're in this sort of like watery space and like, oh my God, you're returned to the original terror. And I think that the anthill does some really interesting things with that kind of effluvial feminine externalized. I mean, there's all those scenes that are in very heavily avoid spoilers here, but there's a lot of oozing and murk and scratching and like these sort of bodily things that are happening, but they're externalized from a specific body. And that was one of the things that was the most uncanny about this book, you know, is it is this really like personal, intimate language, but taken out of the personal and moved into this space that's more generalized.
Oh my gosh.
Which is very scary.
I love that. Can I take you like on book tour with me?
Yeah, I'll be in the corner. Like, I'll be asking questions to just say the whole thing.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
So was that something that was conscious
really...
for you?
Yeah. I mean, people have asked me that, like, oh, you always have characters who are kind of like biting their nails or kind of like smoking. And yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
Take that one to your next therapy session. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of the original question, I feel like, Emily, that's something that really interested me in the body double and in general, I think, is the idea of how much of our identity are constructed. And I think that in the past, if you look at the history of celebrity and like the tabloid industry, there's this sort of stage early in a star's career where there's this image building, right? And it's like, hey, this is your narrative. This is who you are. I'm the girl next door. I'm the glamorous sex bot. I'm, you know, whatever. And then this is like the narrative that we present to the public. But because of social media and the way that we live so much of our lives in this more public facing way now, I think that most individuals, even if we're not like influencers or whatever, still have this kind of persona that we create for people that don't really know us. And I think that was what I was interested in the body double, is the idea of this process. Oh, nice. Men, Women, and Chainsaws in the chat. Everybody go get it from Magic City Books. This process of like becoming the other self, but then again, really kind of taken to this grandiose and sort of uncanny and terrifying extreme. But it is a very small and sort of intimate and almost domestic action, something that we all do every day, right? But then taken to this place of horror. So maybe that again is kind of returning to my idea of what horror is and what terror is just sort of this, everything just moves a little bit bigger or a little bit stranger than you would expect.
Great point. It's funny, I had actually written down permeability in my notes when I was prepping for the anthill as well. Not directly connected to Men, Women, and Chainsaws, but I think it must have been in the ether. Exactly. But both of these books are about the way that identity is really fluid, right? And not, you know, sexual or gender identity or anything else, you know, where we would more commonly use the word fluid, but very specifically about who you are. And, you know, Max in The Body Double has that passage about, you know, you can never really know who you are as a person. You can never really know yourself. And we get that, you know, that's a fairly common refrain, is you can never really know another person. But the idea that you can never really know yourself and who you are is sort of defined by the way people reflect yourself back to you is a really interesting concept. And it's something that's mirrored in the anthill, where Carolina is, you know, sort of disconnected from her own past in ways that are partially informed by trauma and partially informed by guilt. And she's, you know, she's come back to Medellin to talk to Matthias, who she grew up with, and sort of try to get a sense of just another perspective on who she is and who he is, and their shared upbringing. And the way that manifests a lot in the ANTHILL is that she starts picking up phrases from the people around her, or gestures, or and then it starts happening the other way, where Matthias will start picking up phrases from her mother, picking up phrases from the people around them. And it's not necessarily conscious, but in the body double, it's very much conscious, where the protagonist is studying, you know, sweating over Rosanna's gestures and preferences and her favorite wine, and, you know, not liking anchovies in her Caesar salad and that kind of thing. And I think that they both sort of come around to the same place, which is that you can never get inside another person's head, but in the service of that, they both also sort of come back to, but you can't always get inside your own head either. So I lost track of my question in there, but I just think it's an interesting sort of mirror in these two books, and what I really love about having them together. So if you have any thoughts on, you know, the sort of permeability of identity, I would love to talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting inside your own head, right? You're failing to get inside your own head and asking
Yes,
that question.
exactly.
But yeah, totally. I think the permeability of the self is such an interesting thing when it comes to the project of fiction, right? Because the truth is that in our lived experience, we have this idea of ourselves as very static, right? And it's like, we like the things we like, we know the things we know, our bodies are a solid space, and like, here we are, great. But then the closer you look, the more that idea of stability starts to decay, you know? I think of a conversation that I had with a dear friend of mine who's, I think, 7 years old now, my child friend, who had just learned about the fact that all of your cells in your body are constantly replacing themselves. And they were saying something about when they were a baby and something they'd done when they were a baby. And they said, oh, I don't remember it because I had a different body then. And I was like, oh,
Wow.
yeah, you did. You were a totally different person. And so are we all, constantly just sort of shifting and shading. And I think that what I was interested in the body double was the idea of like, okay, what if we are aware of that permeability in a way that's not really psychologically safe for us to be most of the time? But what if someone took on the decision to be like, yes, I am not really real in the way that I think myself as being real. I'm not really permanent in the way that you think of yourself as being permanent. So what are the possibilities then? What doors does that open, you know? And I guess you'll have to read it to find out.
And does that become, you know, a means to an end, or an end in and of itself?
Completely. It's kind of like a haunted house story, but you're both the ghost in the house, I guess. Right?
What if the ship of Theseus but a person?
Literally, yeah. That could be a new tagline, maybe.
It's freely given.
Yeah, please, Emily Hughes.
Well, Julianne, how about you? Those moments of borrowing personality traits and sort of creating a patchwork self in the ANTHILL are really compelling. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like some of the things you guys like were saying about like dipping in and out of like other identities, you know, I was sort of thinking like, wow, that could be like a really good metaphor just for reading, you know, for like picking up a book. Because I mean, when I was sent like a copy of the body double, the sort of introduction I was given about it was like kind of like Alfred Hitchcock. And then when I was reading it, like, of course, I'm thinking like Mulholland Drive, you know, Under the Silver Lake, those kind of classic LA stories. But I think what's interesting about like fiction as opposed to film is like you can really be with someone's consciousness, right? Like even if it's like third person, you can still sort of see the world through a character's eyes. And I mean, I'm not like a film scholar, but to me, I do think that there is something like different about like film and writing. So like in terms of like, you know, what you're saying about, you know, identity and seeing that kind of shown in those like patterns and like on the repetitions. Yeah, it's like, I mean, obviously I'm biased because I'm like, you know, team fiction, because that's what I currently do, like write fiction. So obviously I'm going to be like, yeah, like it's really special. It like does like really unique things. But yeah, I think sort of the ability of a novel to like bring you close to someone's consciousness, so someone else's identity is, you know, it's like I can't really go out and be like a criminal and kind of like, you know, try on different like disguises, but I can like pick up lots of different books and, you know,
Yeah.
like that's the sort of the criminal activity of my life, I suppose.
Totally. I wonder if you ever find, if you're that kind of reader that I am, where if you are spending a really long time in a book or reading with a particular kind of intensity, you find that it's like changed the pattern of your thoughts, the structure, the way you're thinking, and the way you're speaking. I think you're right. I think that's really interesting. The way the books can get inside you.
Yeah, well, it's this sort of exchange of interiority, right? Like there's, you know, as you say, this is the major problem with sort of adapting certain works of prose to film, is you lose that internal, you know, landscape of sign. Actually, that's a beautiful segue into another one of my questions, which was both of these books do interesting things with point of view. The Anthill is written almost entirely in the third person, except for these interstitial chapters of second person, which you sort of gradually realize is actually first person. Whereas the body double is written, you know, entirely in the first person, save for a very striking passage at the end, which I'm not going to spoil. But again, there's this sort of, you know, you never get inside Carolina's mind in the Anthill. You can't be in her head, her, and probably because you know, not in the body double, so entirely that helps us keep the reader in the body double. And I think, you know, point of view in fiction can be such an interesting thing to play with, and I would love to hear what you both have to say about that as writers.
Julianne, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one book I really like was The Vegetarian by Han Kang.
That book rules. Put that in the chat too. Magic City.
Yeah.
I bet they have it.
Where you sort of the central character, like you only see her through other characters. You never really get her first person or her interiority. So I thought that was a really interesting way to tell a book. And so similarly in the Anthill, there are 3 narrators, but I reveal the identity of all 3. Or I guess I suppose like 3 sections. You have this sort of the third person. You have these first person sections that are implied to be, anyway, I won't say more because I don't want to spoil, but yeah, you
Don't
have
give it away.
different uses of point of view throughout the book. And I mean, I guess for me, you know, I wrote this after like a short story collection, and sort of the fun things about short stories is like you can sort of try different things, like different styles with each short story. And so part of me was like, well, why shouldn't I be able to do the same with a novel? You know, like a lot of novels that I really like, you know, they have like sometimes I think the idea of thinking of the novels as kind of like continuous unit, like I don't know like how accurate that is. Like a lot of the books, the novels I really like can be like very fragmented and like very kind of jagged. So there's something about that like I feel that I find like very kind of appealing. And I think it also kind of suited the story that I wanted to write, where like all these characters are, you know, they're a bit messed up, like they don't really know like what they're doing, they're a bit lost. It's kind of you know, an intense situation. You know, sort of the main plot is like a young woman like coming home to Colombia after being away for 20 years. So there's that kind of disorienting feeling of being back in like your childhood home where you haven't been for 20 years. So yeah, so again, like I don't think it was like a conscious choice. Like that probably came later, like in the editing of like being a bit more deliberate, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what I want, like this is like the effect. But yeah, it's sort of, it kind of like suited the kind of story I wanted to tell by having those kind of changes in point of view. But yeah, Emily, how about you with the body double?
That's so, I was so interested to hear about how the point of view in ANTHILL came about for that exact reason, because it occurs in a place where it's like a huge group of people and there's a lot that's in flux, and like the amount of information that people have is always shifting and the power relations are always shifting. And I thought the point of view did a really good job of like capturing that complexity. So I really thank you for answering my curiosity. But yeah, for me, actually, the book started out in third. So I'm like one of these horribly inefficient writers that I just like write like a million drafts of everything. And it's my favorite thing to do. And so I had a version of this that I was working on in my grad program, and it was the third. And I was just like messing around with it, and it wasn't quite doing it like what I wanted it to do. And I couldn't really figure out why. So I like stepped away for a little while, and then I took a class actually on point of view with Doug Dorst, who's a really amazing writer. And we just like read all these short stories using different points of view. And I realized, oh, in the third, you're able to see too much. You're able to know what's going on a very literal level. And then for the body double, obviously that's kind of like a problem because you have all these questions. And then sort of, if you're looking at it from a distance, you can say like, oh, literally, I know what's going on. And I think for me, a big point of the book and something I was really interested in is what we were talking about before, that idea of instability. And then having the reader be in a place where their experience was very like unraveling a mystery. So the answers aren't really given to you. You have to kind of go through this person's experience and see through their eyes and see like what you can discover. And I think that's how I came to the point of view. And then in the section that you're alluding to, it's because there's this slippery subjectivity weirdness thing that's going on, and it's very mysterious. And then that's when the point of view shifts to kind of like go with that moment of extreme alienation, if I could say that without spoiling anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's it's very striking in both books when it happens, when that, there's that point of view shift. The first time the point of view shifts in a book, it is always sort of, it's like a key change in a song, right? You're like, oh, this is doing a different thing now, and it's sort of arresting.
That's such a good metaphor. I feel the same way when I'm listening to a song and the key changes is when you're reading a novel. You're like, oh, now what? This is so cool.
Right, kind of makes you sit up straight and like, okay, totally. I'm going to pay attention because we're switching it up. but Julianne, what you said about a novel not always needing to be just one thing, it can be different things at different points, is very much like what we were talking about with personhood and identity and self, which is you're not necessarily just one person. You're a whole bunch of people in different contexts, with different people, in different situations. And I actually think that's really true of horror as a genre too. Like it's really sort of a mode more than a genre. This is my own, I have a lot of thoughts on, capital G genre.
I think that's so true. No, you're right. I've never heard it put that way, but you're right. It is more of a mode. Because so many different genres of writing can be horrifying and can create that kind of sensation that we were talking about earlier.
Right, you can use that tropes, those horror tropes in anything. You can use them in nonfiction, you can use them in poetry, you can use them in romance. It's just, it's all over the place. But both of your books come from, exist sort of within very distinct traditions that are sort of, so at some points alluded to in the text. Julianne, Carolina is doing her doctoral thesis in Gothic literature, which I loved. As I was like, oh yes, we're doing this. And the body double sort of exists in a sort of noir Gothic space, and those are two genres where I think the border is really permeable as well. So how do you go about, as a writer, layering genre elements and sort of tropes, onto, well, they're, both books are set in times and places that are not sort of typical of those genres. I mean, the body double is LA, so noir, fine, but there are also these Gothic elements, whereas the ANTHILL is set in Medellin, and that's and they're both present day. So you have this sort of adjustment of Gothic and noir to different settings. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how that, oh my God, sorry. My phone was ringing. I would love to hear a little bit more about using genre in sort of a conscious or unconscious way as you were writing these books. Emily, I would love to hear from you.
Oh, totally. So that's such an interesting question, because I'm kind of with you on the idea of genre as like a specter that's so theoretical that it's almost hard to like understand what stops and where it begins, you know? It's all very sort of like mushy. I think that for me, the idea of blending genres is something that is super instinctive, because I am and always have been just like a very ridiculously voracious and indiscriminate reader. I'm like the kind of person, I'm like on a walk reading a book, you know, like it's not healthy. Like in the supermarket, one line for 5 minutes, like what's going to happen next in this book? And I love to read from all over the place. And so I think that then when you write, everything that you experience and everything that you read just filters through. So I didn't really sit down and say like, oh, I'm going to write a Gothic novel, but I love Gothic novels. Like I recently read during the pandemic this book Dragonwyck, which I highly recommend to anyone who is a fan of Gothic novels. And that space is so fraught with the tension of stuff we were talking about earlier, the horror of femininity, the horror of the body, all of this stuff. And then living in LA, growing up, watching film noir films, all that stuff, it feels like it's very connected. Because in both we have the idea of the dangerous feminine. And I think this book is really what I was interested in. It was the idea of the dangerous feminine within. So what if you're your own femme fatale, you know, which is kind of a fun thought experiment. And I think that's what I was interested in. It's more that idea of like that space between genres, like you said, where it's kind of a little bit of everything all at once. Which is the most fun to read.
Yeah, I think Emily, I'm with you in like the club of like the voracious reader of
just
how it's classified. Just yeah, and like I mean, it'd be interesting to know like how many, you know, other kind of guests or writers who've come to this bookshop who've kind of said something similar, you know, just you kind of end up just writing the book that you like reading at the particular time, that you've just sort of like absorbed it through osmosis. But yeah, I mean, I agree with Emily. It wasn't like a conscious thing. I think it was just more like, you know, at the time, you know, I was writing my PhD thesis on this writer called Roberto Bolaño from like Chile, and he uses a lot of kind of like horror tropes or techniques in his writing. So I mean, it kind of annoys me a bit of like, oh, I hate kind of like giving credit to like my PhD to like help something in my fiction, but I guess that's still like nice to know, I suppose. But yeah, so maybe that probably has something to do about it, simply because, you know, he was a writer I just spent a long time thinking about and like rereading. So, you know, I see a lot of Bolaño in the book. And, you know, there were just two other writers I want to mention, just because, you know, I think talking about other books is sort of like the thing that writers most like to do. There's this Argentinian writer called Mariana Enriquez, who wrote a really good short story collection called Things We Lost in the Fire.
That book rules.
That was really good. Like the way she wrote about like Argentina's like dirty war and like the legacy of that, and kind of using like imagery from like H.P. Lovecraft. I just thought the way she did that was so fantastic. So I'd really recommend her. And this other Argentinian writer, like Samantha Schweblin, who's like a novel Fever Dream and like a short story collection. I think it was translated as Birds in the Mouth, or like Mouthful of Birds, but she was really good too. Yeah, so again, like someone kind of using those tropes as a reader, you kind of instinctively recognize, because I think people of our generation, is like, you know, we grow up with, you know, we've all seen the kind of Stephen King, like Freddy Krueger films, like Scream, like that's all in our arsenal, you know, that kind of like dread of like something following you, like something haunting you. That's something that I think a lot of people of our generation would respond to. So yeah, I think this kind of like writing by osmosis is, I would recommend.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because I feel like when you read books, there's this real sense of like intentionality and curation, and there's a sense that someone sat down and like made a plan. But then when you write a book, it's just kind of like throwing a bunch of newspapers in a blender and seeing what comes out. And then you're like, oh, okay, like here's where I have all this gray mush. Now I can start moving things around and making it kind of look a little more orderly, right?
You're like, yeah, like I meant to do that. Like I calculated that, and like
yeah, exactly. Like, oh yes, imagery. Yeah.
I'm just dropping a link in the chat. I have to plug my website. We had a writer do a great feature on Mariana Enriquez. So I'm just dropping that in the chat. But yeah, I mean, as far as the gray mush goes, that I remember, you know, having an English teacher in high school insisting that, you know, oh well, you know, everything means something. The color of the curtains means something, and I'm like, but like probably not always, right? You know, and I'm like 14 and going like, sometimes the curtains are just blue. I don't know.
and I think it's so funny because I think it's both, right? Because I think on a conscious level, they're just blue. But then on a subconscious level, maybe it really is the color of your grandmother's wedding china, you know, like there's always something. But we're just not able to see it because we're too close. It's like one of those magic eye paintings. Do you guys know those? You know, it's like they look like a bunch of blurs and you kind of stare at it, you're like, ah. I think that kind of is what goes on when you're writing a book, is you step back and you're like, oh, okay, there it is. Now I see.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we have brains that are wired to look for, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I think like a good book. I like books where it's like they kind of invite the reader to participate, so you can kind of sort of like decide for yourself and kind of see connections that the writer would intend. I mean, that was something I really liked about the body double. Like I don't like having everything explained or having my hand held. Like I like being like, you know, released into the world of the book and doing havoc with my own interpretation. So
well, I'm glad that you enjoyed that. That was something I really enjoyed about the ANTHILL too. And I do think that like really good fiction should always feel more relational. And I think that it needs to feel almost like a conversation, which is something that the ANTHILL very much feels like, and hopefully the body double too, that it leaves enough space for the reader to come in, you know?
Yeah, I think both books very much do leave that space for the reader to interpret and decide, and that's really valuable. Because you know, some people really do want everything sort of spelled out for them. It's, you know, the people who got to the end of The Sopranos and flooded, you know, HBO's customer service line, you know, with complaints, as opposed to, you know, obviously that's a very deliberately sort of, you know, challenging bit of ambiguity, but like it's nice to just have a little space to breathe and think and like chew on what you just read. And both of these books very much give you that. You know, it's in the ANTHILL, it's, you know, who is the little boy? Is it Matthias? Is it not? You know, is it and in the body double, not to spoil anything, it's but like what does happen to not Rosanna? You know, who is she? And I think that's just really, those are the kinds of books for me that really stick with me and make me go, you know, if I'm lying awake at 4 a.m. going, well, yeah, but like, I guess if, you know, if the ghost was this and if the little boy was that, you know, which I'm sure my husband absolutely loves, but
you're just shaking him awake. Honey, I have a new idea.
Yes, exactly. But in terms of talking about other writers, you know, we've talked about Mariana Enriquez, we've talked about Samantha Schweblin. I would love to hear some of the other women writing horror who you're inspired by, either right now or in the past, anytime.
Oh, a really good question. I think Julianne's right that we always love talking about other writers. Julianne, do you have anyone that springs to mind?
I do actually.
Let's hear it.
I think she might have done an event, or I feel like I saw her on the Instagram page. Yeah, her name's Katrina Ward, and she wrote a book called The Last House on Needless Street. And she'd written kind of 2 other books before that. She went to the same grad program as me, but like we don't know each other. We haven't met. But yeah, I thought that was a really good book. So I would definitely recommend that. And yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
That's a really good one. I haven't heard of that one. I'm excited to check it out. I just finished reading.
It's coming out from Nightfire in September.
Oh, that's why
my computer is currently sitting.
She got the scoop. I
My
love
computer
that.
is currently sitting on a stack of galleys of it, actually.
You're like, oh, I have it down here. Yeah, I've got a
it's,
shoebox and
great book.
It's
ah.
really good. Yeah, and I would say even for people who don't consider themselves as like, you know, I read horror, I like horror. I think, you know, if you just like a good kind of psychological tale about like people, about characters. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Really
Yeah, and I think that's
I
what it
loved
really
her.
takes for me, for horror to succeed as a genre. It's like, if it is just sort of like these types sort of moving through the sort of genre plot, it's really not as satisfying. Whereas if it is really like this more psychologically complex view of like the true horror of being a person in the world, it's a lot more unsettling. And yeah, I was thinking of women in horror, and there's so many amazing writers. But one book that I just finished reading that really stuck with me is this really, really unsettling book from the 90s called The Cipher by Katja Code. I don't know how you pronounce her last name. Emily, can you help me? Kojo?
I'm not 100% sure. I think it's Koja, but I'm not. I don't quote me on it.
It's like
Incredible book.
Yeah, one of the most nauseating things I've ever read. Like, it's very like again, I'm like not trying to spoil anything. It's very like Videodrome. It's kind of like this really grotesque space. But the really interesting thing about it for me is that it's one of the first horror novels that I've read by a woman where the protagonist is a man. And he's kind of like a beta male, and he's struggling with the concept of his masculinity, and he's struggling with kind of like these feelings of competition with other men. And I think that she does that in such an interesting way alongside the object of horror, which is very feminine coded. I'm not going to say any more than that, but it's very, very creepy. And then in terms of like maybe less, not really, like you said, not really traditionally genre horror, but still very, very unsettling. My good friend Ivy Pachoda wrote this book called These Women. Yeah, I know, amazing book.
Okay.
And it kind of takes that traditional horror space, the kind of serial killer narrative, but it really inverts it in interesting and complicated ways, and it humanizes it. And I thought that book was just incredibly powerful. It's not like, I guess, horror qua horror in the same way, but it comes into a genre story and then tells you about the actual people who, you know, live in this world. It's really cool.
I haven't read These Women yet, but Visitation Street.
Right?
I worked at HarperCollins when that book came out, and I was just shouting about it to anyone who would listen, because I was like, this book, because that is a book about people. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's like I said earlier, that's when a genre book is really doing something cool, is when it takes the space of a genre and then it says like, okay, but these are humans whose lives are impacted by these sort of like big headline stories. And I think that's something that I was really struck by with the ANTHILL, because it deals with these things that we think about from a great distance, the issues of, you know, a society in crisis, issues of tragedy, horrorism, issues that are like these sort of big headline issues, but then it looks at the people that are actually participating in these dynamics and what their human experience is. And that's what made it really powerful for me. And that's when I think horror succeeds, right?
I think when people write off genre fiction, be it romance, be it horror, be it sci-fi fantasy, I think that that's what they're missing. They're thinking it's about the trappings. It's about, you know, the color of the curtains, for lack of a better phrase. But it's always about the characters, and that's what, you know, I think any book really lives or dies on. Do you care about these people? Do you want to know more about them? Do you find them intriguing? That's the heart of it.
Completely. And I think it goes the other way too. Like, obviously not going to name any names on this one, but I was reading a book recently where the plot was really interesting, and it was kind of like a horror genre, but I found the main character so annoying that the entire time I was like, oh, I hope this guy just gets stabbed. I'm sick of it. You know what I mean? And it was like, well, this really ruins your experience. So it goes both ways.
Yep. It's very real. Well, listen, we are at the 45-minute mark, and I just wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience. Please drop those in the chat, in the Q&A function. I'm certainly happy to continue chatting with both of you. This is a wonderful conversation. I always love talking to people who are thinking about horror the way that I am, and this has been delightful.
Totally
I would say
agree.
in terms of
a chill up the spine on a hot day like today, right?
Oh, truly, truly. I don't know where both of you are, but it's absolutely disgusting and humid here in Massachusetts.
Here it's bad in Tulsa and it's pretty bad in LA. So
Yeah, I'm
Absolutely.
in Portland and it's probably relatively okay compared to other places, but yeah.
Yeah. Oregon or
Yeah,
Maine?
Portland, Oregon. And then
Okay, got it.
I fly back to England on Wednesday, where it was like 83 degrees a few days ago, and people were like, "We're dying, it's so hot." And I'm like, "Oh, the British, they don't know what heat is." Like,
Right, it was just 115 in Portland a few weeks ago. Yeah.
the heat dome.
ooh, talk
Awful.
about sorry, just talking about England reminded me of another really great horror book by a woman, which is The Little Stranger. That's Sarah Waters' book. Terrifying.
Yes,
Very,
yes.
very, really great. Highly recommend it.
It's wonderful. And back to Katrina Ward, her first book, which in the UK was issued as Raw Blood and in the US was The Girl from Raw Blood. Tremendous work of Gothic fiction with just multiple timelines and multiple points of view and an ending that I really did not see coming. And it's kind of hard to surprise me with an ending for a novel at this point, but I thought it was a tremendous book.
Yeah, I mean, another kind of interesting author to talk about in terms of genre is like someone like Kazuo Ishiguro or like David Mitchell. I mean, I think like especially Ishiguro, I think he was the one where he, had that book like The Buried Giant like a few years ago, where I can't remember the details of the discussion. If like Ursula K. Le Guin was like, it's fantasy, but he's not calling it fantasy, and that's bad. Like, I can't really remember. There was some kind of fight about whether or not to call it fantasy, and like whether like authors of literary fiction were being kind of like spineless by not wanting to like claim their love for genre. So yeah, I suppose this is sort of an interesting, maybe that's an interesting pattern, like moving into, to the 21st century, because it's like we all have so many options of like things to consume, so it's like, I was like a 90s kid, so it's like, you were kind of very like defined by like, I like grunge, kind of like what your tastes were, it's kind of like, and all the older kids, it's like their generation X kids, so sort of like being really authentic and like, being defined by your taste was like really, really important. So now I'm like, is that as important anymore? Is it kind of more about being like porous and kind of like, yeah, I'll dabble here, I'll dabble there. Like, I'm not so restricted. And, I see that as a good thing. I think that like if some, literary authors like want to like take tropes from other genres, but like not really call it one or the other, yeah, I guess it's a discussion that's still evolving.
I totally agree. I think those sort of genre labels are really helpful when it comes to helping readers find something that they connect with and that they love. But I think on a personal level, right, as an author, maybe some people can. I don't want to say I was gonna say you can't, but maybe some people can. But you maybe it's not the most useful thing to think like, okay, this is the space I'm working in, and I can't look over there, and I can't look over there, and I have my horse blinders on, and this is like the genre. Like why not? Get a little weird, life's short, right? I totally agree.
No, there's a tagline. Life's short, get a little weird. We do have a question off the Facebook Live stream. Julio asks, what kind of nightmares do you authors have?
That's a really good question from Cleo. I like it. Get it personal. Okay, I'm really boring because I don't really have nightmares. Sorry. I know. I think I just put that in my books. But when I was very small, I had very vivid night terrors with a lot of screaming. So apologies to mom and dad if you're watching that on the chat. And maybe on a subconscious level, that's what's influencing the more scarier aspects of my writing today. But yeah, it's funny because my work is very, very stressful. I've been told it can be stressful at times. And I recently met someone and she said to me, oh my gosh, you look so much like happier than I would have expected from reading your work because it really stressed me out. And I was like, yeah. I put all that in the book and then I could go around and have a very nice day. So sorry to disappoint you, Cleo, but not really any nightmares on my end. Do you have any, Julianne?
Yeah, I mean, I think like for me, it's like the opposite where, I mean, I think especially since the pandemic, like I've just had like really crazy dreams. I mean, one nightmare I have, and I'm sure the like, a Freudian analysis of this would be like deeply, fruitful, is like not being able to like speak, of just like being
wow, that is interesting.
and yeah, it's like there is probably a lot to unpack there, because I think probably most of us, it's like when you're a little kid, like I don't know if you or anyone in the audience had siblings, but that kind of, not even like game, but way a sibling might torture you would be to like ignore you, kind of like blank you, just kind of pretend you're not there. And that would be really deeply distressing, to just feel that like you don't exist, like you don't matter, like you're not present.
That's terrifying. I have
Yeah,
two siblings. They
terrifying.
never did that. Thank you guys if you're watching. That's very scary.
Yeah, so that's like that. Those are my nightmares of like annihilation, like existential irrelevance. So yeah, I have the COVID pandemic to thank for
Whoa.
that. But yeah, yeah. I don't know if I would even call that like a common nightmare for authors, of just like all human beings. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people like to write, because like it gives you like a sense of control, it gives you something to do, it gives you something to like look forward to. And yeah, I think like in the past year it's been, a lot's been going on, so it wouldn't surprise me if like a lot of people have like turned to writing this year in order to just sort of have like something stable to cling to. I think that's like a positive thing that writing can provide for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it really does give you a chance to visit that dream world and that sort of imaginary internal self while you're conscious, which is a pretty cool gift, Pretty great.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think we are running right up against our time, but I want to thank Magic City again for providing this wonderful venue for us, and I want to thank Emily and Julianne for both sitting down to chat tonight, and also for writing such wonderful, creepy books that you should go buy immediately. Again, see the links in the chat. And I hope everyone is able to stay safe and cool and happy and tuck themselves away with a good book. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you,
Magic
Emily.
City Books, MVT. Love y'all.
Bye.